Republican Congressman Tom Cole. Tom, great to have you on the show.
Hey, good to be with you.
I'm curious. I'm going to read from the New York Times in just a moment, but this budget and the health care plan as it stands now, but this budget specifically, where would that leave your constituents? Where would that leave the constituents who voted for Donald Trump? Voters who are struggling, who feel left out in the cold, voters who wanted to make America great again. Where would this budget leave them?
It'd be a mixed bag. I'm from a heavy military district, so the emphasis on spending on defense absolutely would be very popular in my district and is, and frankly is necessary. I mean, broadly speaking here, what the president's trying to do is broadly right. That is, increase defense spending, but do it in ways that don't add to the deficit. Now, what I would suggest is that he expand and look at the entire budget. That's the real challenge here. You could pay for these things with tweaks in entitlement programs, quite frankly. You could go back to some things. Actually, President Obama in 2014 proposed both means testing for Medicare and what's called chain CPI, which just slows down the growth of programs. Doesn't actually cut anything, but slows down the rate of inflation. And, you know, those yield tens of billions of dollars over the course of a decade. So that's what I hope Congress does. Now, again, the president's right to send up his priorities. We ought to take them pretty seriously in how we appropriate. And, again, the emphasis on defense in a fiscally responsible way is correct. We just need to work in a $4 trillion budget to find ways to do that.
Now, I would understand the voters in your districts who work for the military, but here's the New York Times reports. Mr. Trump's budget also shows little regard for the political sensitivities of his party. His proposal to restart licensing for a nuclear waste repository in Yucca Mountain in Nevada creates a headache for Senator Dean Heller, a Republican who is up for re-election in that state next year. His response was swift and blunt. As has been stated in the past, Yucca is dead, and this reckless proposal will not revive it, he said in a statement. I'm worried about the very people who are suffering in this country who voted for him thinking that he cared about them.
Well, on Yucca Mountain, I actually think he's doing the right thing. Frankly, we've got nuclear waste scattered around the country. It makes a lot of sense to put it in one place. We spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the facility. The only reason why it wasn't put into use is because Harry Reid was Majority Leader of the United States Senate. So, again, that's something we need to rethink from a policy standpoint. It would actually improve safety around the country. So, look, budgets are all trade-offs. And in the end, the president proposes a budget. He did exactly what he's required to do by law. But Congress has to work through. And I would actually be tougher on Congress here, and I'd be tough on the president, too. He does need to look at entitlement reform. That's the only way you'll ever balance the budget and actually begin to put the country on firm fiscal footing. But Congress needs to have enough courage in its budget to lay out some of those reforms, and we'll see whether or not it does. I suspect it will, quite frankly.
Nick.
Congressman Nick Confessore, I was looking at some of your past comments on the NIH. So what's the conservative case for the government to fund basic research, for example?
Oh, it's an overwhelmingly good case. Look, I don't favor cutting NIH or Center for Disease Control. You're much more likely to die in a pandemic than a terrorist attack. And so that's part of the defense of the country as well. The CDC is what protects you from things like Ebola and Zika. The NIH, we have 1.6 million Americans a year that contract cancer. About 600,000 die. That's more people than the Civil War, the bloodiest war in American history. So being on the cutting edge for curing cancer, looking at Alzheimer's, we spend tens of billions of dollars every year taking care of Alzheimer's patients. That's the right thing to do, by the way, but we ought to spend enough money to try and find a cure or to at least slow down that deadly disease. So these, in my view, are cuts that are very short-sighted. These are investments the country ought to be making. They're every bit as important as what we do with another Ohio-class submarine or with, you know, a new F-35. I'm not saying those things aren't important, but these things are important as well.
All right. Eugene?
Congressman Cole, Gene Robinson, the one thing the president's budget does is essentially begins to dismember the Environmental Protection Agency. It was founded by another Republican president, Richard Nixon, who established the agency, and it's he's cutting essentially 30% of the EPA. How can that be a wise thing to do?
Depends on what parts he's cutting. Now, again, the EPA has already been pared back a lot. I think that's what probably folks don't realize. Its budget's about 20% smaller than it was in 2010. So it's not as if Congress has not been pretty strict with the dollar here. I would have to be fair, look at it in more detail. About half, almost half the EPA's budget, frankly, is grants for clean water and tribal grants, things of that nature. I think those are actually pretty popular and pretty well served. The regulatory function, there's no question they put some things in there that are not particularly popular and I don't think particularly helpful. So we can look at it, but I think the EPA will, it'll get a haircut, but I doubt it will be quite as deep as this budget suggests.
Congressman Donnie Deutsch, always nice to talk to you. For a moderate, I'm actually very, very hawkish. So, and protecting us and our military feels a primal need of basically making sure we survive. Having said that, as somebody who's a CEO, when you present a 10% increase in something, I'd like to understand why and say, oh, here's why our nuclear, weaponry is falling behind and we need to do X, Y, Z. Doesn't there need to be some actual left brain as opposed to an emotional explanation? We need more military to justify that being such a huge part of the budget.
Well, and there actually is. If you look at both the defense authorization bill that was passed late last year and the defense appropriations bill, which has moved through the House and now we're in the Senate, look, we literally only have 3 or 4 combat brigades ready to deploy right now out of 50 some odd. Our training is down. Our pilots aren't getting enough airtime. Our equipment's old. We've been at war for 15 years. You need some of these modernizations like an F-35, like a new tanker. So these are actually wise investments. We're well below where Secretary Gates thought we should be, and that should probably be where we look. Before he left office, he laid out a long-term budget that, again, would have, frankly, would have more money than even President Trump is proposing at this particular point in time. So I think he's a pretty thoughtful guy, and I think he's somebody who's both parties trust. And I will just tell you, we've been underfunding the military and overusing it for a good decade now.
All right, Congressman Tom Cole, thank you very much for your